Now, once we go through and take a lot of time and do that, we can come over here and check out these options. So smooth just smoothens the edge of it. So if you can't really see it that well, I'm going to zoom in. And if we set it to, for example, black and white, and we can see this selection here. And if I go to smooth, it makes it a lot smoother, right? And we can really overdo that, so we want that to be somewhat subtle. For this example, I don't think we need to use it. Feathering just makes the edge a little bit softer. So typically we want something very subtle, and we can have a softer edge, so it's just not as drastic looking from a masked area to a non-masked area. And contrast will make the dark areas darker and the lighter areas lighter, so there's more of a definite edge and not as many areas of kind of midtones or grayscale in between the areas that are masked out or selected and areas that are not. All right, and then shift edge will do just that. It'll either shift the edge inward or outward. All right, and by default that's at 0, so we're not shifting it at all. We can clear the selection if we don't like it, or we can also click invert, and then we'll obviously invert it to the opposite. But for this example, let's go back to onion skin and just preview what it's going to look like. I'm going to press Control or Command minus to zoom out. And if we go to transparency, set that to 100%, we'll notice this right here needs a little bit more work, of course. And I'm doing this pretty quickly for the video lesson, but again, we would just go back to 100%, go to on black, for example, for this technique. And right here, we really need to use more of the refine edge brush tool. We could also make this 2 layers. You could duplicate the layer and do the hair on one layer, and then do the rest that has more of a definite edge on a different layer. And it all depends on if these tools are working correctly for these specific areas. If we want to feather the area that has the hair, but we don't want to feather the rest that has more of a definite edge, then we could just duplicate it. We could go back after applying this and press Control or Command J on the layers panel, and that will duplicate it, and you could adjust the masking so that it shows through from one layer to the next. So I'm going to zoom back out a little bit here and adjust the opacity just so I can see how there are a lot of stray hairs over here that we're not including. And if we wanted to include those, we would want to use the Refine Edge brush tool and really paint those back in here a little bit more, like so. All right, over here as well. And some of this will cause a little bit of fringing on the edges with the color. And if it looks okay as far as blending in with the background, that's fine, but if not, we can color it later with the brush tool, and I'll show you how to do that. So I just have this at kind of a mid-tone area, painting a little bit more. I'm doing this pretty quickly for this example, but hopefully you get the point. So we can also check out what the edge is looking like as far as the width of it. So if I go to radius and I go to show edge, so you can see the edge there, and we can see some of the painting in I've done with the Refine Edge brush tool. But if I click Smart Radius, what that does is certain areas like down here, even before I brushed it in, is going to be wider because it's trying to include all that hair than a definite edge just like over here where there isn't hair coming out with some stray hairs. That's going to be wider than this because we've got Smart Radius checked. And so we can see that when we have show edge checked, it's previewing what that edge is looking like as far as the edge of our selection. So we can increase the radius if we want to. We can really overdo that, so it's good to be careful with the edge detection. So I'll go back to opacity, and you can see the before and after. We got a couple areas in here that we really would want to zoom in and fix. And again, we can probably use the Refine Edge brush tool. With here, we could use the brush tool or the selection tools like the lasso tool or the polygonal lasso tool because there's a definite edge. But we want to use this Refine Edge brush tool wherever there's hair. And this is a little bit tricky because it's right next to her hand. But again, we take a lot more time typically doing this. Just showing you the technique. All right. So down here as well, I can use the polygonal lasso tool. And Click once. There we go. All right, so depending on the edge, if it's a definite edge, we can use certain selections, certain selection tools. And when it's something like hair, we really want to use Refine Edge Brush Tool. When it's like that, or just goes off the edge a little bit. Now, once we're ready, we can click Decontaminate Colors, and you can see the before and after. It colors in a little bit of this hair here so it matches more closely to the other hair where we haven't painted in with the Refine Edge Brush Tool. Because it looks a little bit too light, it might not be noticeable in the final result with that different background, but you can try that. Now, if that doesn't look as realistic, there's another technique that we can do. We can actually paint in with a clipping mask, which I'll show you how to do that. But if it looks better, depending on what the background is, go ahead and use that. But I'm going to show you what it looks like without decontaminating colors. And where it says output to, let's go ahead and set that to layer mask and then click OK. And what that does is it goes ahead and adds a layer mask right here. So if I Alt or Option click that layer mask, it will show it right here. We can still edit this. This is why we mask instead of erase. So I could use the brush tool and make sure the mask is selected up here and paint black or white in to either mask out or bring pixels back in to this layer. I'm going to press Alt or Option and click the mask in again. I can also press Shift and that will deactivate the mask. And if I hold Shift and click it again, it'll bring it back in. Now, a cool thing about this technique is while this mask is selected, if I click Select and Mask, it will bring that back up. And now I can click Decontaminate Colors. If I thought, I want to try that, and I click OK, then it'll have that effect. And that looks pretty good. Or if I go back in the history panel or just press Control or Command Z and go back to before, and we don't want to decontaminate colors, there's another way. So if I just press OK, and this is new layer with layer mask, if we press decontaminate colors, we can't just do a layer mask, it has to put it on a new layer with a layer mask. But for this example, I'll just show you another way to color some of this hair back here if we find that there's a little bit of fringing. So I'll press OK. And then up here, let's go ahead and click create a new layer icon on the layers panel. And then we can hold Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac and hover between these two layers and click. Or we can press Control Alt on the PC or Command Option on the Mac and then G with this layer selected here. And that will make this a clipping mask. What that means is if I paint on here, on this layer, it will only affect the visible layers on this layer below it. So I can select, for example, the brush tool. I can select a foreground color here, or I can press Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac and just select some kind of color here by clicking while holding Alt or Option. And then I can paint in, for example, right here. And I can Alt or Option click again to sample often, paint in right there. And if we overdo it like that, we can keep painting, or you can add a layer mask to that one as well. So if I add a layer mask to that, and again, if we paint black in, it will remove the pixels. And if we press X, it'll flip those so that white's in the foreground. It'll bring those pixels back in. So the cool thing about this technique is that it's a mask and we can still edit it after the fact. So we have this mask right here. So we can adjust the edge of this. So add to or remove from the masked area by painting white or black in. So that is the select and mask technique. I do suggest using that instead of the Refine Edge technique if you have the newest version of Adobe Photoshop Creative Cloud. But again, if you do want to access that older, simpler method, we just want to make a selection first and then hold Shift and go to Select, Select and Mask. And they both have some of the same options like making the edge of the mask or the selection smooth or feathering or adding contrast or shifting the edge. But the newest Select and Mask technique has more options. Now, of course, we would want to adjust the lighting in these layers as well. And so we could adjust the saturation, the lighting with options up here that are also in adjustment layers like levels and curves and so on. And we just want to make sure we're on that layer and not just the mask when we apply those changes. Because of course we want our layers to match as far as where the light's coming from and the color and the white balance between the layers. So that is the select and mask technique. Thanks.